Okay, so does anyone need a link?
No.
To what? Oh, I can use a link, sure.
Jack you guys in. Jacking in. Sick. Where's my Skype run leggings? Okay, so the very first class is the Glade Runner. There used to be two classes, just like two sides of the same coin for the Glade Runner. It was Glade Runner and Sap Seeker, which is why you see 10 abilities listed under Glade Runner. It's because, or sorry, 20 abilities listed under Glade Runner. It's because we used to have two classes worth of those. So the Blade Runner in the past lore was this. They were basically like the Tower Watch guys. They stood in trees at the end of the forest or the edge of the forest, and they wouldn't even really patrol. They just had their own trees that they would hang out in with like I don't know, a pipe or something, and their own bedrolls. And if anything came within 100 feet of the perimeter of the forest that was living, they would kill it, unless it was a trade caravan that had already been scheduled. And they were pointed in all directions, more or less. So a decent portion of the elven population would spend most of their time at the outside of the forest instead of back at the city to protect it, to make sure that nothing got in. And if need be, to make sure that nothing got out either, in case there was someone who was trying to expatriate. And what I was thinking would be an interesting story for this elf, or an interesting moment in the story of this elf, is that they're near to one of these guys is near to a human civilization, and one day there are two children who run out to the edge of these woods, and um, you make a decision, basically, of whether to kill a child who comes too close or not. And they're in no uncertain terms. The rules are you kill anything that gets within 100 meters. I mean, that's drilled into you. Um, so, do you perceive them as a threat or not? And obviously, clearly, they're not a threat. Um, and it's one of those. I think you were talking about one of those moments just there for narrative. It's one of those like nice, beautiful sunny day sort of moments.
Yeah.
Um, I wanted it to be something like that, where it wasn't you. It was clear that the player almost all of the time wasn't going to take the action to kill them. He was just going to watch them play from a distance, kind of question whether his orders were always correct, or how much of a judgment call it is, and something
If
like that.
that's a place you can visit over and over again, it's really eerie.
Yeah.
Like there's like a spot on the wall or whatever that no one goes to. It's like decommissioned or whatever.
Hmm.
And so you're like the guy assigned to go there and make sure nothing's happening. And so there's always just that one kid who shows to like play soccer or whatever. And so you just always just watch him.
You're just watching on the outside, yeah. And the idea is basically just that the forest proper. The boundary of it is the wall for this civilization. Um, and one of the story things was going to be that at some point they decide to grow all of the trees at the edge together and wall themselves off entirely with magic. Uh, I don't know if we're going to go for something like that now, or if it really even makes sense to. But basically, that
Mm.
the decision was there to either wall themselves off completely or to continue living as a part of this connected world that they don't really want any part of, or at least that they're told not to want any part of. Um,
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought too much about the Elven Society, but I remember all this lore, or most of it. I like that image either way. Like even if they aren't xenophobic, the concept that you have to defend a wall and you're commanded to shoot anyone who comes nearby is still actionable in lots of different kinds of societies.
yeah,
Uh, So it's not something we can get rid of. I think it's a
Okay.
cool idea that that's like a thing you can revisit.
What might be interesting is if you're told to change positions at one point in the story, and then you
Hmm.
change back to your old post, and the kid doesn't come by anymore.
Yeah, like that's what I've been thinking about in the Cavalier story. Like I'm trying to, at least in my stories, I'm trying to keep alive the idea that there's a reusable area that's like changes over time. It doesn't matter what you do, like it just has its own life.
Mm,
And if you keep returning to it, you like get updates and like see what's changed.
that's cool.
And so like in the Cavalier story, there's like this place where you always see like a certain kind of weird hallucination, and it talks to you, and you like make friends with it. And after years and years of doing this, like it's died, and like it someone's taken over its house, and like they're telling you how it died and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that's a cool idea. It makes sense with how I've been thinking about how to tell a story in our like limited resource capacity.
Okay. All right. Well, let's. Does anyone else have any thoughts on the Blade Runner before we keep going? I think that's more or less what it's going to do. It's going to be on the outside of this thing, not providing you a view of the central town or like the main place.
I
But
hope so.
okay. Um,
So he's isolated and he's got this job, but you don't get if you just play as him, you don't the player doesn't get a whole lot of context of why he needs to do his job, what's inside to save
right.
being the Blade Runner.
Those are questions we don't answer with this class. Just that you have orders, and it's very important that you follow them. Do you follow them?
Cool.
Um, okay, so
I'm sad all of a sudden.
sad. Yeah.
What a sad, true thing to think about.
Yeah, I think that that's something that our vignette story structure will really afford for us, being able to go after stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so the bog wallow is an idea that Henry and I worked on a while ago. I would say the idea is predominantly Henry's, and I really like it. But um, basically, the forest has been greatly diminished from its once quite enormous sort of size. I couldn't come up with the exact words I wanted there, but it used to be this very vast thing. And then this war with the orcs happened, and the orcs took a lot of the forest for lumber and clear cut some of it and burned down a lot of it. And so, even though it's still considerable, it's not nearly as large as it once was. There are whole towns that were destroyed, quite a bit of life that's left. And the elves have a religious connection to this forest, or at least a magic connection that they've put into more of a sort of naturalist religious context. Um, and since they have influence over how things in the forest work, since they can more or less grow their own structures out of the trees, um, and even on a sort of low level, suggest to animals what they should be doing, where they should be going, um, such that they can even control whole caravans with no elves attending, just animals moving the caravans if they needed to. Um, it's fairly important that there be a source for this energy, um, for all of the change that's going around, and the elves themselves aren't quite enough of a conduit to carry it all. And so there's this subclass of elves that volunteer, with scare quotes around volunteer, for a position um, within these swamps, basically. They take living things with them into the swamps and they drown them, more or less. And they commit their own energies to maintaining this forest, or the powers, the magics within this forest. It's one of the few classes that will have that actually interacts with magic in a way that is directed, or in a way that they completely and perfectly understand what it is that they are causing and what it is that that's affecting. Um, and more or less, they live their lives within these swamps, such that it even disfigures them from being in it for so long. I I didn't really know where to go from there with the kid of this guy, or really what the issues would be. Um, Henry and I talked some about what types of people would be called to volunteer for this, or um, what they would do with political prisoners if those were involved, or prisoners in general that came through, or people who had violated the sanctity of the forest. They'd be dragged off to these pits, or these mud pits, basically. But I don't know. It was a while ago that we worked on it.
Henry, do you have more thoughts on it?
Um, yeah, something that you might have touched on that we talked about when we were first working on it was this idea that the it's the maybe during the big orcish attack and exodus of the what would later become the Dark Elves, that the forest itself and the spirit god, whatever, of the forest. Well, the forest was pushed past this sort of ecological tipping point, and that the elves maybe um, unintentionally were sort of informed by the forest itself that they needed to do this thing, otherwise the forest would diminish and eventually go away. So it's there. So the idea was maybe that the bog wallow was just he was just that the entire order, whatever, was just kind of like I don't know, uh, throw water on this fire that they weren't they're not. The idea was maybe they don't have a way to solve this problem of the forest dying. It's only this through this kind of spooky um, swamp magic that they can just like halt the um, uh, destruction of the forest.
So they're on a fool's errand, like kind of a PR political, like we're just doing this because there's nothing else we can do kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, and
Uh,
then another thing we also talked about was how other elves saw this sort of thing, and it's we agreed maybe it's a you don't really talk about it with other elves. It's like it's seen as sort of this necessary evil even amongst the elves, and you definitely don't tell other races if you ever interact with them. It's this kind of big hush hush secret amongst the elves themselves.
hmm.
Yeah, no, I remember that part, and I think part of the very interesting thing about it. There's another thing that I just thought about while you were speaking, Henry, uh, where the forest sort of tells them that this needs to happen. Perhaps they're told erroneously that it needs to happen. Dave, your mic is cutting in again.
What do you mean
Uh,
erroneously?
perhaps the forest isn't being completely honest with them.
Hmm.
Perhaps it sees an opportunity. I mean, it's not entirely clear how magic works, but the elves, more than any other race, believe that they understand it. And perhaps they believe, to a certain extent, that they can control it when that's not the case at all, when they're being manipulated by this entity that they've created through magic. Maybe that's not something that we even ever really directly mention as being the truth, but perhaps these things don't need to exist, these bog
Maybe.
wallows.
I mean, we haven't really designed anything that like tries to talk about magic or interact with magic. I think it'd be a good place to explore or open up,
Yeah, that,
or
that
at
it,
least the thought that like what how elves think they think about magic. Like even if it's completely wrong, like like these elves try and interact with something and only get like 5% of what it actually is
yeah,
would be interesting.
yeah. I mean, they're very prideful about it. Like they have a huge amount of hubris tied in, and that they fundamentally misunderstand their place in it, such that they're creating this almost sinful thing, this ugly these ugly, misshapen elves that spend most of their lives inside these bogs powering this forest that doesn't need to be powered by them, I think would be very. I think it would royally piss off some elves if they knew. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have
Mm.
the character maybe realize this, and
I don't know.
something that they struggle with for a while.
I'm not sure like when or how they'd come across the knowledge, but maybe they see it in like this fleeting instant at the very end of the storyline when they're dying or something inside this swamp. It's this moment. Um, we were talking jokingly about orangutans the other day, and I promise
Mm.
this ties back in. But we had this
Okay.
idea for a little opening cinematic for our game, or for like a 1 minute trailer where um, there would be a turfoxel flapping its wings, and turfoxels are a turtle fox owl, basically.
All right.
I don't know. So it's flapping its wings, and it's this terribly misshapen creature, and it takes forever to get wherever it's going. Um, and on top of a number of other things, but basically it's flapping its wings, and you see it flapping its wings, and it's clear that it's trying to go somewhere quickly, but it just can't. Like tropically, it's moving so slowly that the scenery around it's passing by like inches at a time. Um, and then it cuts to this image of a orangutan climbing a tree, and then it cuts back to the turfoxel, and it's cutting back and forth, and the turfoxel is getting more and more like aggressive and flapping its wings, and it seems like the terrain around it's picking up to another speed. And while that story is going on, that the turfoxel is getting where it's supposed to go, you keep watching this orangutan climbing, and as he's climbing up, he starts to like there's a voiceover narration almost that comes through, and at first it's talking in orangutan, in that sort of voiceover, like ooh, and then it transforms into this more human sort of thought pattern, and then almost in a Galactus sort of way, as he's climbing this tree, galaxies start spanning out from him, and he starts questioning his existence as a orangutan. Um, and of course, all this time he's trying to get to one piece of fruit that's high above him. Um, but he starts to question his existence, and then he questions the existence of everything, and then he becomes one with the galaxy basically, and has this very emotional, ineffable moment where he realizes that everything is. I don't know what he realizes, but he realizes that everything is, and he is a part of everything, and it's very much that description you get from a person who's had a really good trip on something, and they're trying to recount it to you, but they can't, except for he's recounting it perfectly eloquently in like little text that's going across the bottom of the screen. He's just spiraling out infinitely, and then he grabs his piece of fruit and falls off the tree. And you cut to the turfoxel, and it's clear that this whole time that he's been flapping his wings, he's been trying to go from the middle row to the front row of a combat field. And then the orangutan falls on him and flattens him, and his little turfoxel feet are sticking out from under the orangutan. And then you cut over to looking at this little party of adventurers that have been looking at that side of the grid the whole time. And like, that's it. That's the minute long cinematic. Um, but the way that relates to me is that I think it would be interesting to have a moment where this bog wallow is maybe in conflict with something, or something is killing a whole bunch of bog wallows, or for some reason some people have been able to get into the swamp, or maybe it's elves that get into the swamp and they're actually killing the bog wallows. Maybe it's like a separatist elf group that hates that this exists, and they're trying to end it. And as he's dying, as he's falling into the swamp, he starts to have that sort of idea where he's very connected with everything, and he's thinking through it, and he realizes exactly how um, insignificant his part in all of it was, that it was really for nothing. And the
Mm.
player gets that closure, but it's clear that the elves will never know.
So in this scenario, we don't indicate that what they're doing is pointless.
In this scenario, we don't indicate to the elves that what they're doing is pointless. Only the player
But if
gets it, and it's only in like this fractured glimpse, the last moments of this character.
okay, so the player doesn't really know either till the end.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Perhaps it's every time. Maybe it's no. I don't know. That's kind of too tropey. Like every time they get into the swamp, you see these like flashed images, and then when you get to the end of the story, the images all make sense.
Yeah, it makes no sense.
I agree.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't know.
I don't
I'm not
know.
sold on it.
Neither am I, but I think it would be interesting. I think that if we're choosing any class in which to explore the subject of whether the elves are having any real impact, or if the forest was lying to them, or if magic is something that is kind of fickle, or is fickle depending on who's channeling it or who's worshiping it. Like if it's manifesting according to the social mores of a given race.
What if it's something like their use for the magic that they have and their perceived need for it is sort of circular. Like the presence of the bog walls creates a state in the forest that they're comfortable with, and they kind of know how to exist in. But if say they lose a few bog wallows and bog wallow production drops for a little bit, and that state is altered, and it's perceived as this a bad thing, and it's perceived as the decline as the forest as a whole. But it's actually just like it would just be a temporary thing if they lost all their bog walls at once, and it like in a way the bog wallows are sort of poisoning the forest in this way that requires the bog wallows to come back and pump more juice back into the thing.
So you're sort of you're creating an allegory for ideology within a culture,
Yeah.
being this thing that's inescapable, and I think that's interesting. That's certainly something that I would like to comment on at some point in the game. I think we are commenting on it, at least in a number of stories, even within the Wood Elves with the sort of Tower Watcher guy, but with the goblins as well. That's a more direct comment, but I don't disagree with having something more direct like that. I think we just need to obfuscate it to a certain amount with the player so that they're not perfectly aware of the fact that, unless they're really paying attention, they're not perfectly aware of the fact that these guys aren't necessary.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know. It's like I don't have a clear character direction on this guy or on these guys. I don't know how a character would fit into that. I can think of them as a group, but not really as a singular person. I think certainly you'd be looking at why the person chose to volunteer, or if they chose to volunteer for it at all. What their day-to-day existence looks like, what kind of conflicts they're drawn into. Do they travel around a lot? Because that's all important for combat. Is most of the combat that they're doing in their mind, or not immediately represented on the map as something? Like, are they connected through the swamp and fighting off magical maladies that would afflict it? I don't know. I think that's an interesting thing that we could look at.
Pass. Kind of. There's lots of things. Like it reminds me of a story I almost wrote about a hardcore environmentalist. And one day she woke up and radiation had gotten into like a swamp, and all of a sudden all the trees started attacking everybody, and she became the leader of the trees attacking everybody and killed all the humans with the trees, and then died alone.
Lovely.
Yeah. Like to me, like the job itself, it would attract someone at least who believes deeply that what they're doing is important. If it's voluntary, like it would have to be someone who's diehard a believer in the environmental ethics of the culture.
I think it could be semi-voluntary. It's like you've got enough people volunteering for the army that you don't need a draft, and then all of a sudden that drops off. Now you start.
I think it could be semi-voluntary too, but like if it comes to a point in elf culture where even the people running it like realize that it's pointless, then there could come a point where like people start dying and the number of people working in the I don't know whatever it is the gang becomes smaller and smaller and smaller because they're just like discontinuing the whole thing.
That might be interesting for you for you to join at that point,
Yeah, it could be.
where like it's kind of yeah. I mean, the nuclear reactor analogy is probably a good one. It's like you're tending a nuclear reactor, or you're in one of those submarine films. I forget what it's called. There's one of them where the core for the submarine, or one of the nukes that they're handling, starts to malfunction, and they've got it set away at this one point of the ship, but it's gonna blow if they don't fix it, or it's gonna go. I don't know. It's gonna overheat basically and fuck up the whole sub. So they send in person after person, individual by individual, and these people have horrible radiation burns and like they die agonizing deaths, but they're trying to fix it. Um, so basically, they're tending this core more or less, or I guess at least analogically, that would be sort of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I don't know. Not interested in that idea either.
So where would we take it for it to be interesting?
uh, well, I don't know. Like, I'm not. For some reason, I think it's kind of interesting to have like a thing. To me, it just seems like very tropey, and it's been done a lot where someone is assigned a task and then realizes at the end that it's pointless. Or at least to me, like it seems easy to like pull that trick on an audience, and kind of unfair. At least it wouldn't be fun for me to write. Like I wouldn't write that story. Someone else might find it funner, and I'm okay with that, with them writing that story. But if I'm gonna write it, I wouldn't write that story. It's
So
just me.
what if the person finds it pointless? What if the act itself is ambiguous and the player doesn't know whether it is contributing something or not, but the worldview of their player is that this act is, or of their character is that this act is pointless, and they've been roped into doing it regardless.
That might be interesting. That concept brought something else up to my mind in which like the character is convinced that it's meaningful, but we give the player evidence that it's meaningless.
Hmm.
And part of creating the character would be like inciting a sense of doubt in the character that the player's been assigned,
So we're looking at like
and then challenging that doubt.
dramatic irony.
Uh, to an extent, I don't. It depends on whether we even want to reveal the truth.
I think we can
The
hint
concept
at it
could-
without revealing it for a person who's really paying attention.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, to me, it still seems like it's a little shallow.
Let's deepen the bog then.
All right. Um.
What does it need? I mean, generally, just adding gravity to the situation doesn't help anyone.
I don't know. I just think making it meaningless, like I think if someone did it forever, like some people would either like kill them, like at least in a real world situation when people are assigned a meaningless duty, like most people figure it out because it's their job and they do it every day. That's meaningless. The people who don't figure it out either in like a case of denial or they're just really easily fooled and gullible. And the last one is just that they've been driven insane by how meaningless it is and like commit suicide or try to escape the job or challenge the manager or leader type or something like that.
Sure.
Because lots of people are in meaningless jobs. Like it's not an unreal world scenario activity.
See you later, Henry. Thanks for joining us. Well, I had an idea, and this isn't supposed to be a comment on religion or anything like that.
Okay.
But certainly for an atheist, if they were asked to be a preacher for the rest of their life, they would derive no meaning from it whatsoever. And it would be that sort of situation for them where
Mm.
they go to work every day and they just want to kill themselves. But for someone who believes in whichever religion they're preaching, I mean that's certainly different. They're deriving meaning from it that doesn't necessarily exist intrinsically.
Hmm. Okay. How about this? So there's a thing that the player knows is meaningless, and everyone else involved knows it's meaningless. But but your player character is the one person who actually believes in it.
So he shows up and everyone there is like,
Everyone's like, "You realize this is a joke, right? Like nothing you do here is important." And they're like, "No, no, it's got to be real. Like, of course it's real."
right.
And
And
so
then
like half of the story is like discovering, or at least like trying to drum up like false truths in order to repatent your own view in the world.
that might be interesting, yeah.
Yeah,
It's definitely different than doing it from like a cynical standpoint. And I think it's more
yeah,
interesting
like
to have the character that the player doesn't necessarily agree with.
I like that. Like you're stuck in this like it'd be funny simply because you're like stuck in a situation that you probably don't want to be in unless you are a person like that. I feel like I know a lot of people like that. Like I think everyone kind of has a part of them like that actually like even though they don't have any good proof in one thing, they're like, no, that thing's real. I know it.
Yeah.
Like that's the illogical like emotional truth
Well,
part of people
I
probably.
I believe it.
Yeah, I believe it.
Believe it.
I forget the term for that. It's where you
Well,
it's
it's
not
blind faith, but
right, but it's there's a certain term for buying it, for buying something and then becoming attached to it because you bought it.
yeah,
I forget what that's called. It's attached to
brand
buyer's
loyalty.
remorse, but it's like you purchase
Kinda.
something and then you as soon as you hear something bad about that thing, like let's say you bought a TV and it's got a line running down the middle of it, you're more likely to stay with that TV because you bought it.
Hmm.
Like you became
Well, yeah. Why
attached
would
to
I
it.
get rid of something I just bought?
Yeah, but even like all right, let's say hypothetically that you buy a PS4, and this is the example given in the Wikipedia entry, but I just can't remember the name of the thing. You buy a PS4 and you bought it because your friends have PS4 and now you're playing PS4 and you realize that it doesn't have a great selection of games. I'm not saying this is true of the PS4 for people watching, by the way. You realize it doesn't have a great selection of games, and in fact the Xbox One has a fantastic selection and you should have bought that thing. Usually what happens is you create a whole bunch of defenses in your mind for why you did buy the PS4 and you argue against anyone who has an Xbox One because you're trying to rationalize your purchase to derive some value from it, some value that's not inherently there because it's now connected to you in some way, or at
Right.
least many people do. um, Brand loyalty, advertising, etc. Those are the factors, but I think that'll be something, an interesting sort of psychological space that we get to explore with that character.
That could be cool. And then my next thought is like the next turn of the screw is maybe we join the story in which like this character's been bumbling along for a while and actually does discover a way to make their job meaningful. Like everyone was wrong, but the person discovers something that's actually a problem that they can solve and is immediate. And all of a sudden, like people who have been like laying around like for years and years and years doing nothing have to scramble together to solve this one thing led by a person who's completely delusional about most of their lives.
Well, what might be interesting is that that actually is afforded for by the system of magic. That issue, that problem that you're talking about, could just have developed because they willed it into existence.
Oh, but then the Ritsmith.
Not really. I mean, the Ritsmith works on a different axis. They're lying.
Mm.
Their mistruths are creating
So,
things.
so in some ways, it's a bit of an opposite of the Ripsmith. That this
Yeah.
person just believes so much that this one thing was possible that they willed an issue into existence.
Right. Yeah.
Hmm, that's interesting. I kind of like that. That magic is like so effervescent that you like by believing in something so hard that you just make your own you make your own like life obstacles.
Yeah.